Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Offensive Security Club meeting. Today we're going to be going over dueling blue teams. Um, first things first, we do have attendance at attendance.offsec.club. Um, so go fill that out, please, and thank you. As far as some events going on this week, we have. You can go back, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. We have Hack the Box Battlegrounds going on this Friday night at 6 p.m. Central Time in the same Discord that I am currently speaking in. If you want more details, you can check the CTF or channel on Slack or the general channel on Discord for updates. We also will be having our regional CPTC team competing on Halloween. We should know the results in the evening on that next day, November 1st. And if we need to be a wildcard winner, we would know that by around the 16th or so. So we will try and give updates inside of the Colonel Popper's OPSEC Slack if we find anything, or if we win or move to nationals or whatever. Additionally, the boot to root machine walkthrough is up on our YouTube channel at youtube.offsec.club. So if you were having trouble getting into that, or if you got into it and wanted to see how the intended way of how we got into it, it is up on there. You can watch it, ping us with questions. The OVA is still available, and if you need the link, we'll be happy to give that to you if you message us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Angel. Keep in mind you could submit questions at questions.offsec.club throughout the meeting, but the rest of the time I will yield to him. Go for it.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I'm going to do kind of a basis over dueling blue teams. And what I hope for this to be is kind of like a primer for the in-depth topics that we do next semester, such as AV, evasion, certain advanced kind of exploitation techniques that we try to get into for next semester. But yeah, so a lot of you have probably tried a CTF or done CTFs or are masters of CTFs. Normally, you'll enumerate, you'll get creds or some type of access that you've enumerated, and you can make as much as noise as possible as you want using SQL map or Nmap or masscan or derb or nicto. You can pretty much just have a user shell open all day just trying to run privs scripts, and if the box gets bonked, then just reset it and try the exploit again. They're really good for honing your skills, learning new commands, or trying cool stuff and learning new exploitation techniques. Now, actual entities hopefully are a bit tougher. I actually worked at a place where there was a instance of a machine on our network that was just like a hack the box easy challenge, and within about an hour of testing some stuff, we got root. Um, but you're up against a lot of different technologies nowadays as a red teamer. More specifically, you're up against things like data loss prevention, intrusion detection, firewalls. You got blue teams, security information and event management like SIEMs, like Splunk or Graylog. You're up against patch management, audits that happen every so often, end user awareness training, so your phishing won't be as effective. And Metasploit modules just won't cut it all the time. Hopefully, again. Now, I like to say to truly embody a threat, you have to grow as your opponent or your target does. Well, we'll talk about what that means more in a second. We're going to be going over kind of dodging or weaving blue teams in reconnaissance, exploitation, and post exploitation phases. More specifically, going over what footprints you leave during certain scans, evading certain technologies that are meant to monitor or prevent you from gaining access, and of course, blunders, because I always find those funny. Most of them from when I was starting out and learning some stuff. Recon phase. So, a few vital questions here that you have to ask yourself is, what is my identity that I'm using to interact with this entity? Can I get that information without touching the resources, whether that be passively or enumerating through an indirect source, something of that manner? What logs are you writing and what alarms are you raising? And that's always good to keep track of, especially the identity part. If you're doing any type of OSINT and you're using social media, it's a good thing to have multiple social media accounts and know which ones are going to be interacting with the company, whether it be social media or even email. Some goals you can have to dodge blue teams are going to be to try to normalize your traffic. Now, when I say normalize, I don't necessarily only mean trying to fit in with actual normal traffic. I mean trying to normalize weird traffic. So that's one tactic that I've seen used is you might have heard a joke story or something like that of somebody trying to rob a jewelry store. And they kept triggering the alarms every day at like 4 a.m. when trying to rob this jewelry store, but they were just going there to trigger the alarms. Well, after a while, about a week and a half, they triggered the alarm and they broke in, they got all the jewels and got out. Well, it's a funny joke, but it does have some truth to it into that system administrators and people who manage those systems and monitor those systems can get normalized to this feeling of, oh, there's something new on the network, or hey, that's weird, but it's been going on for a while and it hasn't really made a mess. Um, Another tactic, of course, could be to fit in with normal traffic, try to blend in with actual valid users or visitors to a site or a system. And normally, you also want to try to hide anything that might go against the baseline that they've set up. So, for instance, if you're already inside a small network, you don't want to just run a bunch of scans throughout everything, as maybe there aren't that many packets going through the network in and out, and you don't want to kind of raise that baseline up or raise something past the baseline that they have recorded. Now, some technicals to go over in terms of using passive information gathering. I'll say Shodan and Census, you can consider as kind of looking up targets that have already been port scanned. The footprint has already been left by these automated services or bots. It's up to you to use that data now. Another instance can be the web cache or Wayback Machine. More specifically on web cache, that could be a Google site. Um, if you go to Google, and I think the Google dork for it is webcache:site, then you can do that. You could also see it if a site has it available by green arrow under the link, and I'll show that here in a second in kind of a Google search. You can also look at public breaches. At this point, a lot of companies have been breached, and you will find that could be reused throughout certain organizations. And if not reused, it at least gives you some type of baseline to creating a custom word list for a specific account or user. You can also look up a history of DNS records using DNS Dumpster, Risk IQ Community. Those are just to name a couple. Those records have already been searched up, they've already been tallied up by these database search tools, so you don't really have to go out and query that company's DNS server, make those logs. So I'm going to go ahead and show the Wayback Machine, or just a little example of it. Let me escape real quick. So we'll go ahead and Google search for Dakota State University. All right, so we've got the home page, and you might have seen this before, but if I go ahead and look at the cached version, this is kind of a subdomain that Google has that will show us if they've archived a web page. Now, granted, this information will be out of date to a certain degree, but it can still be pretty good to get a level up on past information of your target. And basically, this doesn't make a log because it's already made a log. You're just viewing what was yielded from that log using cool thing. Let me go back to presentation. All right. Another thing is coming out of a certain number of IPs. For instance, a lot of people will talk about coming out of a dedicated IP during tests. Depends on the scope, but in terms of combating an active and monitoring blue team, you want to keep track of these IPs and try to diversify them. So, for instance, some people will use Proxy Cannon. I love Proxy Cannon. I think it's awesome. If you don't know what it is, GitHub search that. It's a cool tool that lets you come out of or funnel your traffic through AWS instances in the cloud, big data, AI, keywords, whatever. Um, you want to maybe stay away from that because that can actually get detected by blue teams if they do some research. They can say, oh, this IP comes from AWS, it's allocated to their pool. These all come from AWS and they're all part of the same pool. So they can look at that. Another thing is if you have a certain VPN provider, and you're downloading different VPN config files from that provider, well, the IP could still belong to that provider and be registered to the same provider name. So that would get you caught and blocked. It's kind of in a sense how Tor traffic is blocked to a lot of sites and certain networks. because it's Tor, and people are going to say, oh, well, that doesn't need to be open, or we don't need to allow that anyways. Some other like small things is user agent. Usually when your browser makes a request, it's going to have a user agent in the header. And what that's going to say is it's going to say, hey, this is my browser type. Now, of course, we can change that super easily, but just be wary of default scan configurations and tool configurations. For instance, curling a website will give a curl user agent of the version number and everything. So that may be not normal looking from a system admin perspective or from a blue team perspective. Any other weird user agents may stick out. And we'll see here in a little bit that Nmap actually has its own custom user agent if you don't change that. A little more on gathering information during recon. Voicemails and email signatures are awesome to get. This is kind of risky, actually, because you could set off alarms, but the payoff for it, as long as you are kind of tying your loose ends and whatnot and paying your dues, could be pretty big. You could use a burner number or an email to call after hours or on a holiday, and that could get you some type of voicemail box information like, hey, I'm out on vacation, won't be able to take calls between this and this time. It could actually get you email signatures. You could see, like, maybe you've gotten an email from a staff or instructor here at DSU and it has that type of signature. That could be important too for social engineering later on. Some companies would actually train against this as well, is reporting certain, like, hey, blank phone calls, or reporting short interactions that seem to be a way to elicit information out of the individual. Sometimes it is better to pretend to be external than an internal employee, or entity, I should say. Now, this all depends on your target. If you have assessed the target and you've come to the realization, hey, I should probably try to mimic internal personnel, then go ahead. It is all up to you. These are just some pointers and from stuff I've learned. So familiarize yourself with scans and footprints. Now, a lot of us doing CTFs and whatnot will start with Nmap or some type of port scan to understand what's going on the server and what we can get in to see the windows that are open. Go ahead and show a demo right now of what that will actually look like sometimes. So I'll go ahead and clear my Apache logs. Some of you may have seen this from previous challenge and noob to root. So we cat, actually in the directory, cool. We got no logs. My service is running, so I'm gonna go ahead and nmap, and we'll just do a simple script scan. We'll say port 80, because that's what it's running on, local host, it's all hosted within this machine, and we'll hit run. Cool, and we got a cool quick response because it's localhost, of course. Now, if I cat my access log, you'll notice something interesting. Wow. Some water, excuse me. So right off the bat, we've got a lot of information in a short amount of time. Now, on a actual company device or perimeter device that's serving a web server, then this could look like nothing in terms of the amount of traffic generated. But there are a few key indicators here that could tell a blue team, like, hey, that's weird. That shouldn't be done. Because normal users normally don't send weird hexcode bytes or have a user agent string of Nmap scripting engine with a URL to the Nmap homepage. Um, and it's also requesting a whole bunch of different types of things. So we've got the usual robots.txt, which that's fair. The Nmap script scan will also encompass get and some other options, variables to try to get options from that server. So just a like quick little example there. And Nmap, depending on how fancy you get with your scans, reduce the number of requests substantially, or you can have it through a bunch of requests, probably on accident. Just keep that in mind if you're going up against maybe an adversary that is monitoring and is saying that, hey, we're going to block your IP if we see some weird stuff. So looking at this, we've also got, oh gosh, let me hit that key. Let me double check questions. Don't think there are any questions in the offset questions. Okay. So looking for or enumerating for some type of injection or foothold, whether it be a web vulnerability or anything like that, try to make your enumeration of those look like typos. That's a good suggestion a colleague gave to me once, is testing for weird characters. something like looking at a PHP application and passing some type of weird character if it's returning something to you. Uh, oh, okay. Thank you for the question, Buffer. Gotcha. So, yeah, testing for each of those characters, you may have seen in certain CTFs, people will throw a whole bunch of weird characters like colon, semicolon, single quote, double quote, anything like that, to see what sticks or what is shot back out in response. And this is kind of like a more long term, or not long term, I should say, long played out version of that. We're just trying maybe a couple characters at a time or one character at a time. What's the best way to learn offensive security if you can't even into any hack the box? That's a great question. Well, hack the box, I will say, when I started out, it was very challenging to me, very difficult. I would say one of the best ways to learn offensive security specifically is to familiarize yourself with the actual systems, and managing those systems and kind of creating those systems. Another thing could be online tutorials. Maybe there are certain challenges that have write-ups that are outside of hack the box that are allowed. Looking through those could actually help you in terms of looking at the methodology if you're just completely lost on certain challenges and whatnot. um, you'll have to google for around for some of those, and certain challenges, like specifically ones on hack the box, I don't believe write-ups are allowed. But for other rooms, like try hack me has certain rooms that write-ups are totally allowed for. You can do that. If somebody has a blog where they've done that type of work for a challenge that's open to everybody, then you can do that as well. Try Hack Me rooms were awesome. Yeah, Try Hack Me. I'm a big proprietor of them. They're not paying me to say this, I promise. But they're really cool. I try to go on there and look for topics that are I'm not familiar with at all. So if I see like, oh, iOS pen testing. Oh, okay, cool. I've never done that before. Let's try it. So yeah. Anyways, at the Recon Technicals, that was a little off track. Sorry, everybody. List using Durbuster. So file your target enough so that you know what word list to run. For instance, you're not going to want to run an Apache enumeration word list against an IIS web. Kind of not unfeasible, but just weird to do, and it's extra, in my opinion. Go blunders. So we got a log here, of course, with the Nmap scripting engine as the user agent showing up in the Apache logs. It's like, oops, that was weird. I've also got a sock account that followed this eCorp account on accident, so definitely another blunder. Picture at the bottom is a kind of parody of a famous sticker called "Hack Naked," which means to hack from like your own IP or from a IP that uh, basically hides your IP. That's not an advertisement for the VPN. Now, moving on to the exploitation phase, there are a few vital questions here. Are you breaking into accounts, or are you breaking perimeter device functions, or are you doing something else? Where did you get the exploit in your tool? Metasploit modules have signatures, exploit DB scripts are out there, they're public, right? That's how we get them. Um, what's the footprint made if you fail? What happens if you succeed? For instance, this could be if you're trying to brute force accounts on a certain network. Are there certain lockouts that are going to occur? What happens if you actually get in? Are you going to get caught within a relatively quick amount of time? Have you crashed a service if you failed to exploit a buffer overflow properly? What happens if it does work and you do get a shell? In best case scenario, you're in. Just be prepared to answer those questions and have a game plan for those. Now, if you do fail, you have to remember, hey, where does that put your access, and where are you going to be starting out from? Where are you going to be recovering from? For instance, if you fail to phish another user through a compromised account, that could be the end of that user's lifetime in your hands. The user's account, I should say. That sounded a little weird. Talking about social engineering. So, yeah, I suck at social engineering, phishing specifically. Make sure to keep the same name when on a phishing call. One of my very first phishing calls, I changed my name about 3 times. Luckily, nobody noticed. But looking at the recording, it was like, wow, that was rough, but it was really fun. Had a lot of. So another thing to keep in mind is what happens if your credibility is questioned. What happens if you call up a certain user and you say, "Hey, I'm from the help desk." They're like, "Well, we don't have a help desk." Well, you have thinking on your feet type of mentality with that. Hanging up might not be the best thing to do, and just leaving it there, because they could then alert the actual help desk, or not the actual help desk, but the IT or the sysadmins, and say, hey, or to smooth it over, or say like, oh, sorry, wrong number, or something of that manner. Without a pretext, though, hang up Whitey Cracker called social engineering. A quote lifted from that is, "Someone at the company is bound to help." So that's a just a cool thing to keep in mind. Social engineering is awesome. Just be creative and build your identities out more. Oh, the link doesn't show up all the way. That's fine. So talking about exploitation details, more on the actual technical side of things, is attack patterns are recorded, right? Certain APTs, advanced persistent threats, are going to have methodologies that they use to get into networks, and those are going to be reported on. The link I have up here is MITRE Attack Patterns Database, if you want to call it that. It's got good documentation on certain attack methodologies used by these identified groups. Now, talking about payloads, I like to say talk is cheap, signatures are cheaper. A lot more AV solutions are moving towards behavioral detection and refining that, and we'll get to that more in a second in terms of bypassing that and whatnot. But you've got things that are observed like imports, weird function calls, weird IP callbacks, things of that nature that will stick out instead of just, oh, that's a different hash. Now, the solution to bypassing this would be a number of things. It's not just going to be one silver bullet for it, as much as we'd hope. Um, Use encryption for your communications. Your payloads, I think with Metasploit, you can have encrypted payloads that use HTTPS. It just depends. And this could also come down to if you write your own payloads from scratch. There might be cryptographic libraries you can use to have some type of encryption implemented for your payload so that going across the wire, it looks like junk and it's encrypted. And then upon entry, it's actual readable code and it's executed properly. Now, that all with that a little bit. I've been trying to write some try hack me malware just for persistence, and I'm kind of going the direction of using OpenSSL and Bash just because I'm not the best at using C and the C language and C++. Interpreter shells won't always cut it, and I do have a little AV bypassing blog down there that I've linked that I thought was pretty cool. Interpreter shells and MSF Venom generated payloads may not work right out of the gate, and that's fine. You know, it just drives us to be more advanced with our tactics. Talking about payloads a little bit more, specifically my experience with bypassing AV and whatnot had to deal with Cortex EDR. Some of you may be familiar with that or not. Before, I think it was called Palo Alto Traps, I want to say, is what the product name was called. Either way, that one and a couple of others I had observed can be broken down into kind of two parts. So you have the first, the local engine, which is the local scripts or the local detection antivirus thing that's on the computer that's going to actually look at your scripts and look at what you run and protect you locally. Then you have the keywords, cloud AI, big data, machine learning, quantum threat library indexer, whatever, the end all terminator in the cloud, right? Well, the thing is, this may seem like a big threat to us, but there are a few catches and just the inherent nature of how this is set up. Normally, you do have a window of time before Resolved gets published if you can get your payload past the local engine. Um, my experience personally is about 12 to 18. I got my first shell popped. Well, I noticed that my shelter encoded payloads with just regular reverse TCP shells were caught at about 12 hours, whereas interestingly enough, Visual Basic script payloads, like unencoded, not modified at all, not obfuscated, got detected and reported into the engine about 18 hours after that shell got to see. Because normally you would see maybe a faster time for that type of shell getting popped. Now, this all boils down to one rule that the endpoint did have is that if it's grayware or it's considered some type of software that's unknown in terms of its purpose, then it's going to go ahead and just allow it to run. It doesn't really care. That one actually relied on checking the imports of certain executables. And if you gave it as executable that already used WinSock32 DLL by default and you embedded your payload into that, then it would bypass the local engine and give you about 12 hours for an opportunity to get a shell. Now, with that being said, custom rules can be written if maybe a blue team is trying to get a custom rule pushed out for that certain malware that they see on their network, because it is going to be 12 to 18 hours before there's an actual fix from Palo Alto or some other provider. Then you can do a couple of things. You can actually change your binaries just to change the hash. You can add useless code. You can run it through an encoder. Just pull a Sharknado with the payload. And what I mean by that is keep the same purpose and make sure that payload is still functional, but just put a bunch of weird stuff in there just to make sure the hash changes, just to make sure it makes the job of the blue team and the forensic people and the incident responders that more difficult. And I've got some links here. So I've got Adventures in AV and Leaky Sandbox. It's a bit unrelated to stealth, but it's just a cool exploitation technique where they actually got shells from cloud sandboxes that were analyzing their malware. I've got the MSF Venom cheat sheet, a link to Shelter down here, and then I've also got, oh, this thing will stop moving, Defender check down there. So talking about exploitation technicals as well, in terms of more social engineering things, tie up loose ends in terms of interactions with users. Phishing calls shouldn't leave the user wondering, because that could easily raise alarms. I was part of a pen test where we actually had the opportunity to look at help desk tickets that came in whenever we social engineered the help desk. And I would social engineer the help desk, and then I'd log into the portal. And this was merely just for my learning of, oh, this is what showed up in the help desk software. We didn't use that towards the actual pen test. It was just kind of for my sake. But we actually noticed that there were a lot of times when we spent more time on the calls, more times on the pretext, that the help desk tickets were generalized or made more generic. For instance, there was a user where I called in as this user, and I said, hey, could you, in short, I'll just sum it all up, could you run PowerShell and exfil this data for me? And the user had a question about PowerShell on the phone, which I thought was super funny, but that's a little nerdy, a little out of pocket, but it was just awesome to see that. So spend more time on trying to keep those connections with the users, because you don't know whenever you're going to need their account or their access again or something of that nature. Now, with that being said, kind of a side note, never discredit the company's support team. Even if you're trying to social engineer and whatnot, that's just a bad move in terms of allowing that company to recover and adapt, because, well, the solution or the mitigation for social engineering is end user education. Well, you really want to make sure that the company support team is able to have that credibility afterwards and say, hey, we're going to train you how to not click on links on emails, how to answer the phone and not give out information, um, things like that. You don't want to discredit the company support team, because that would just add insult to injury and not really fix things. And that's not what red teaming or being the um, impersonated attacker is all about. You can always follow up with calls or emails. This is in terms of the technique, but you can send an email and you can send a call right after, and you can say, hey, did you get my email? Da 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 da, X, Y, and Z. I need you to do this. And that causes what I like to think of as a human system interrupt. That forces them to pay attention to the phone or to the topic and actually get you what you want, hopefully faster and hopefully with less interaction. Now, this is all just suggestions and based on some research I had done. Be happy to change it to use whatever works for you. Just kind of some notes I thought I'd throw in there. Users walk away happy and compromised. Okay, I've got a question. What's the best way to learn how to write a payload? Well, I'd say the best way to learn how to write a payload is actually like strengthen up on maybe programming skills or just knowledge of how um, command execution works for your language of choice. Because payloads don't always have to be reverse shells. They could be disable the firewall, disable antivirus, ping this machine, or just make copies of yourself. So kind of just get familiarized with a certain language you like to use, and then Google the heck out of it. Google how to write a reverse shell. Google how to write system commands in Python or something like that. Just have fun with it. Another thing I have on here is weakpasswords.net, talking about word lists a little bit and word list creation. You don't want to use just RockU on against brute forcing users. You want to use something more modern and more stylized for those users and those accounts. For instance, some passwords, actually most passwords in Rocky probably don't even match complexity requirements for certain organizations. So it's just going to be a wasted attempt or a possible lockout or just a waste of time. So got that link there. That's a cool one. Thank you to Andrew Kramer for showing me that one. That was awesome. Got another question. What's the best way to get a password? Um, depends. Depends on the system and the user and what type of account. For service accounts in like an Active Directory domain, it may be to try to enumerate the heck out of it and try to see if it's maybe you can get its password hash by Kerberoasting and cracking. Maybe you can look through company information or call up and say, hey, is there password format? Or just fish somebody out of it. It really just depends on your environment. You could also maybe write a type of phishing page and, of course, just throw that up somewhere. So, yeah, talking about fuzzing and execution in terms of exploitation, reduce your word list to what are needed. You really don't need to be running like 100% of every word list you find online. SQL map is definitely a noisy tool that hopefully we've all at least tried to use. It can be tweaked to reduce a certain number of requests, but I actually had a friend who just said it was better to just write your own and try to interact with the endpoint in that manner. Can we fish Cody Waylu? Huh. I don't know. Probably could. Let's set it up. Let's try it out. Get his permission first, though. Talking about bypassing web application firewalls, WAF, is so talking about more traditional ones. Regex is normally the way they have gone. But of course, you have new developments in terms of behavioral analysis and whatnot that will allow strictly only these characters or only a subset of characters, which is still kind of boils down to regex. I've got bypassing WAF. It's just so expansive in terms of how it's changed, and by kind of like an arms race. So I've actually just linked a whole bunch of resources in here. This Black Hat bypassing WAF. I think it's from 2012. It's pretty old, but the basis is awesome in terms of teaching. Hey, I modified this web request and got a different response, which is just the basis of it. So got some exploitation technical blunders. I want to talk about this one up here for a little.
Hey, Angel, we lost sound on you.
No audio.
I was about to say. Logan, you're quiet too. You're lighting up.
Good news, you can't hear us either.
You never said we couldn't fish you, so I mean, it sounds like permission to me.
This is Offset Club. Can't you offset into his computer and fix it?
This is Offset Club, not IT Club.
That's why I'm here, is to learn how to.
Oh gosh. Okay, gotcha. Oh my gosh.
Hey,
Did that
it's
just
better.
happen? That's weird. So I just switched to Discord and the audio started working again. Okay. Well, we're talking about changing the hashes on this executable. So, gonna do a simple overview. Can you guys hear me still?
Yeah, as soon as he came back in. Yeah, now.
Oh no. Okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. Sweet. Well, let's see. We've got this. I'll just echo some weird things. So like weird. Let me do single quotes so it doesn't replace anything. I'm actually going to append that to the back of coolbug.exe. Okay, now we look at these, and they're different. Oh, that's cool. Now, the question we might be having is, does it work? Well, hopefully, right? Let me just bring it over. Oh. Okay, so I'll go ahead and wget 10.0.2.4. We'll say, I think this served on port 8000, right? Yep. We'll bug.exe. Oh, nice.exe. Okay, cool. So I got it ported over to the Windows box. Let's listen for connection now. And we'll say nice.exe. Wait. Yeah. Still can hear me, right? Good. I'm assuming that's good. Okay, cool. Well, anyway, we got a shell that way. And this is with our modified executable. And if we actually take this value and paste it into VirusTotal, we got no matches found, which this doesn't mean like, oh, it's a silver bullet, it'll get through any AV. It just means that we've changed our payload. So this is kind of just the basis of what we'll really get into next semester in terms of antivirus evasion and switching up your payloads and whatnot. You could also do this just by modifying your language and recompiling if you've got one of those types of languages. Just depends. So where's my PowerPoint? Boop. And then also I've got a couple of blunders here where try to sudo attempt and it's like, oh, hey, that's logged. Well, this is the log of that attempt. I've also got another attempt here trying to use rocku.txt for an SSH thing. Can I recompile in Spanish or Russian? I actually don't know. Does GCC have any type of like language barrier or anything? I don't know. Either way, assembly, I think, is a good language. Just try that, hopefully. Now, talking about exfiltration, this is where it gets super creative, in my opinion, and can get pretty funny. Some vital questions you have to ask yourself in terms of exfiltration is, what identity is going to be called back to when your payload kicks off or when you get your payload actually going? What protections are in place? What you have firewalls, you have data loss prevention that's going to stop you. Some things to combat this, just to bring up a few examples, are ICMP reverse shells, DNS tunneling. You could use encrypted HTTP tunnels using TLS or something of that nature. You could use SSL as well. You could also have an employee just do it for you if you're going to go for full social engineering. I've got a little talk here, Black Hat, bypassing data loss prevention mechanisms. It's a bit dated, but the general concept and idea is awesome. Talking about post-exploitation, the technicals, you have to have persistence in terms of dealing with once you're in a system, trying to keep that foothold for as long as possible or having it do things later on. Your computer security incident response team, hopefully I didn't get the acronym wrong, they can't always just re-image a machine that you pwn every time. There's business continuity planning that has to go in procedures, and certain machines have to stay up a certain amount of time. And what are you calling back to? This could be dependent on your payload. Are you calling back to an EC2 instance hosted in AWS? Are you calling back to a DigitalOcean droplet? What's kind of your route of interacting with that post-exploitation module? It doesn't have to be a super complex type of post-exploitation thing. It just has to do the job. A couple of examples is an extra SUID bash shell. So basically copying the /bin/bash to a weird directory once your root, of course, and adding a sticky bit, or not a sticky bit, an SUID bit to that, so that whenever it runs using -p, it'll give a root shell to whoever ran it, because it runs as the owner, not the user who ran it. You could backdoor the pluggable authentication module. Those of you who attend DefSec may have talked about pluggable PAM. I'll just say PAM from now on, it's easier. May have talked about PAM and its authentication capabilities and kind of centering that authentication around one focal point. There's actually a cool blog here that Andrew Kramer recommended to